Yeah, it's on.
J'ai l'impression... Oui, ça y est, ça remarche. Nous allons reprendre...
Right, we're about to begin.
Pardon. Avec donc la première table ronde
We're going to
de
start
l'après-midi.
with the first roundtable discussion for the afternoon.
Voilà, les
We're going to be
compétences
talking about competences for conservation and restoration.
Élargi, modifié,
How have these competences evolved over time, if at all? And we have Kate Seymour, who will be moderating this roundtable discussion. She works in Maastricht, but she's also the ICOMCC chair, and she will be moderating this roundtable discussion. And there'll be a list of questions that will be displayed for the panelists, because she's having difficulty speaking today, unfortunately. So please do look to the screen for a reminder of the questions that are being asked. So we have here Laura Fuster-Lopez, who chairs Encore, and she'll tell us all about it. We also have Maggie Laupser of the University of Pretoria, Satish Pandey of the Indian Institute of Heritage in New Delhi, and Luis Souza, who I think is a former ICOMCC chair, if I'm not mistaken, from the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil. You have the floor. Kate.
Thank you, Clementine. As you can hear, my voice is not improved this morning, but I'm going to try to moderate this panel. Welcome everybody to this afternoon's session. This session is titled, it's all about competencies, training a new generation. And as you just heard, all 5 of us on the panel here today are educators in conservation training programs globally. And today we'd like to just touch on that aspect of training and skills and knowledge, and applying those to the preservation and conservation of cultural heritage. We have prepared a number of questions, and each of the panelists is going to have a couple of minutes to answer each of these questions there. And as moderator and without a voice, I don't really want to take up too much of the time, so I'm just going to pose the questions. Our first question is, what is the training situation for conservation in your university or your region? And are there other pathways to training as a conservator other than the academic process? And I'd like to first pose that to Luis, if you could have the floor for a couple of minutes.
Yes, good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank the Fédération Française de Conservations-Restaurateurs, as well as ICOMCC for this invitation, and also to salute those online and you here. Well, in terms of training in Brazil, we had, particularly in the 60s, under the influence of Paul Cormans, we've started some training activities, but not at the universities. In the 70s, specialization courses, but nowadays, starting on 2008, with a program from the federal government of Brazil, we have 4 training programs running at the undergraduate level, and somehow each of them is related to graduate studies as well, not in conservation, except for the Federal University of Pará in the Amazon, where they do have a program in conservation. So, if it's 2 minutes, then I'm almost close to that. We also have training of technicians, particularly in Ouro Preto, where there is a foundation of Arts of Ouro Preto, where they train technicians and what's called technologists, a group of students who are at the Federal Institute of Minas, where they have a training related to built heritage. But these 4 programs are undergraduate in conservation of movable and integrated heritage. Thank
you, Luis. I think we'll come to Laura at the end, but in Brazil, I think you have on the table one of the older training courses in within this group. Yeah. And maybe I can move to Maggie, who's got maybe the youngest training course in the group, to talk about how you've set up your course and what are the possibilities there.
I have got the dubious privilege of running the first master's program in heritage conservation in sub-Saharan Africa. We're only 5 years old, and our course was specifically set at a master's level, not at an undergraduate level, because we realized, and now I'm moving into the next question almost, as conservationist profession is not really legally recognized as a profession in South Africa, Southern Africa, and many other parts of Africa, we needed to start having people in decision-making positions where they can then create the posts for an undergraduate course in 10 years' time. Of course, this has another side to it, and that is that we make sure that nobody leaves our master's program thinking they're suddenly a restorative conservator who can go and do hands-on restorative work. We make very, very sure we let them do just enough hands-on so that they know what they can't do. So our program is heavily focused on teaching people ethics, preventative conservation, and then heaps and heaps of material science, which hopefully gives them the decision-making abilities to decide once they're in the profession, okay, I need somebody from this field or this field to do this or that.
Thank you. Thank you, Maggie. I think our point is coming across, but I'm going to move to Satish next. You are working in a very large country with almost 1.4 billion people and represent a training course that is relatively small compared to the number of museums that are in the country. Can you explain how the Indian situation approaches this issue?
Right. Thank you, Kate. I think the first formal training in India started in 1989 with the establishment of National Museum Institute, which is now called Indian Institute of Heritage, where I come from. But it is not that the training in conservation didn't exist in India. There were several universities offering courses in archaeology, museology, heritage management, etc., and they were offering a module in conservation right from the, after independence, after 1950s or something. There are certain, few number of certificate courses run by different organizations where 3 months or 6 month training program is given, where emphasis is mostly on hands-on practice. So the first training program, National Museum Institute, started in 1989, and since then it has been offering a formal postgraduate degree in conservation and also a PhD in conservation to students. We take a fairly small number of students each year. It is mostly about 12 to 15 students. So looking at the enormity of the cultural heritage in the country, this number is hugely insufficient. However, looking at the unorganized or poorly organized sector of conservation or museum, it is not possible to take a large number of students and, if you are unable to provide them with jobs. So this is the current situation in India.
Thank you, Satish. I think it's a nice balance to now hear Laura's point of view. She represents an organization that coordinates 42 different training organizations in Europe. So as a global perspective, well, not global, but a European perspective, can you give your answer to the question?
For me, it's not that straightforward. As you say, I am representing so many institutions with different backgrounds and different realities, but for those that are not familiar with the European context in this table and and online. In 1999, we have the Declaration of Bologna that was aimed to create a common educational system for all Europe that provided us with a common structure of bachelor plus master plus on top of that a PhD. But also was giving us common tools such as ECTS credit systems and a quality accreditation system and also the diploma supplement. With all this, what I want to say is that we have different realities, but we have a common structures and we have common boundaries about what the training of professional conservator-restorers has been. Together with this, in the 25 years that ENCOR has been working in conservation, restoration, education, we are really proud of being hand by hand, very closely working with ECHO, that they represent the professional side. So we are developing different documents that try to explain how we try to define the educational needs as a function of what the market demands. And it has been a very fruitful experience working all this time with them. And this is why inside the different realities we have in different countries regulated by the different policies, national policies, we have this common structure that ensures that at the end what we understand as a professional conservator restorer accessing the market has had a 5-year learning process comprising 300 ECTS and with the specific competencies defined for the bachelor, for the master, but also for the PhD levels. So this is the best summary I can do for all this big structure in 2 minutes. But,
Thank you so much, Laura. I think we can move on to the next question now. We wanted to showcase that globally the profession is very different stages. In some areas of the globe it's very nascent, in others it's much more established. And Maggie, you touched on this in your first question. How do you see, is the field recognized in your country? You answered that already a little bit, but where do you see it going? Where do you think we should be aspiring to?
We are actually working together with all the museum professionals to try and get professional recognition, because there might not have been official or training programs, but we do have conservators in Africa, of course. Most of them European trained, but much more linking in with this morning's discussions, we have many, many people who did artisanal training under European trained conservators. And as part of our entire looking at how we can professionalize the profession of conservators and give them the professional stature, we also grappling with these problems of how do we handle people with years and years of hands-on practical artisanal experience.
I don't know if that touches something with you, Satish, in terms of India. The Archaeological Survey of India has a century-long history there, but conservation field is quite new.
Not really, Kate. Conservation field in India is not, conservation training is new, but conservation field is not new. The first conservation laboratory was established in 1917 in Archaeological Survey of India. In 1956, in the first General Assembly, in the 9th General Assembly of UNESCO in New Delhi, ICROM was born. And it was established in 1959. And since then until 80s, majority of museums have sent their conservators to be trained at ICROM. And it was only in the 1980s when the need for developing an institution to train conservators within the country, it came to discussion, and then in 1989 the institute was established. So the conservation profession is not new. Conservation field is well recognized. However, there is no accreditation system as of now or legal provisions to make conservation profession or education in conservation mandatory for practicing as a conservator.
And Luis, I know that in Brazil you're you're about to have a law signed there, and maybe you can illuminate the audience a little bit on that issue and relate it back to the discussions we were having this morning.
Yeah, back in the 90s, I remember very well, 1994, for example, we used to have the meetings of the Brazilian Association of Conservators, which was very strong at that time. So it used to congregate about 350, 400 people in biennial conferences. This association in particular has several problems now, so it's no longer active, but we still have several other professional associations in different states in Brazil. So these, together with the new courses which were installed in 2008 at the Federal University of, I have to tell the name of them because, you know, it's Minas Gerais, Rio de Janeiro, Pelotas in the south, and Pará in the north. We still have gaps, for example, in the northeast and the center-west, but since 2008, we've been really struggling to have the profession of conservator-restorer recognized as an official profession within the field of, under the Ministry of Work in Brazil. So nowadays, in 2008, we failed because of some interpretation questions, but nowadays, the project is very, very well developed. And what I would like to give here, my personal experience, because I'm a member of this commission, is the way we have to handle with the museologists, for example, because museology in Brazil is a profession recognized for many decades already. Archaeologists also have their profession recognized. Historians, they do have their profession recognized, as well as archivists and library. So we wanted to go into this realm. And then, in order to do this, of course, we have to recognize what we do, which is particularly our competencies, compared to what they, the others, they do. And then this is a game where we have to gain terrain or give terrain, and it's working. It's working because, for example, if you talk about preventive conservation, it's not just the conservator restorers. You have museologists, you have archaeologists, and they also deal with this as well. And just finalize, for example, if you think about the reality in Rio de Janeiro, we have 3 professional masters which would give us an example of how the field is organizing. We have, for example, in the Health Institute of Fiocruz, Fundação Fiocruz, which is a very big institute for vaccines. They have a professional master's in preservation of health sciences. At the Museum of Astronomy, they have a professional master's in preservation, not conservation, restoration, I should say, in the heritage of science and technology. And at the Museum of Astronomy, they have, at the Casa de Rui Barbosa, it's a professional master's in memory and information. So the field is organizing itself, which is very important, the discussion we had before this session.
Oh, thank you, Luis. Laura, I know you're not representing a country today, but the situation in Europe is very diverse. Could you give us a little sketch?
Well, I agree with someone in this morning saying that in France, restoration is for those running a restaurant. It's the same in Spain, but the truth is that this is, someone else was saying, it is, let's not confuse terminology with profession. It's of course not, but it is true that terminology is the first step to gain dignity and recognition in the field, because it has taken so many decades or so much effort to write so many documents, to find an agreement in the profession, and to find the recognition for the professionals. As you say, in Europe we have different realities. We have countries that have a regulated profession, we have countries that have no regulation at all, and then we, for example, have the Italian case, and I will suggest the speakers this morning looking in the Italian mirror. Italy was a country with such a diversity of training institutions, from the big institutes, the 3 big institutes, then universities, regional schools, other non-formal training, and so many years ago already started a process to have this unique cycle of training, but also recognizing the professional and dividing them into 2 categories as a function of the training. If Italy was able to run through that project, it was not easy, it was very complex, but it was something that it was really challenging, and they accomplished satisfactorily. So we have the different realities. And I will say that in the absence of a professional recognition, a professional defense of the profession, the universities, the schools, the training institutions have a big responsibility of defining properly the competencies of the programs we are delivering, because this inclusivity of providing the crafts their place in the cultural heritage field is, of course, the crafts are needed. Of course, we need the crafts to reconstruct, but reconstructing is different from restoring, from conserving. There are different words, again, different terminologies to define different competencies. And in this field of cultural heritage, there is place for everybody, but it is important that being inclusive in the laws don't mix the different competencies professionals have. And we are making an effort to have the proper educational framework. ECHO is doing big efforts to provide the proper professional framework and guidelines and recommendations, and we need from the laws, from the politicians, to make the effort to provide the appropriate legal framework, to have a place, the right place for everybody, because we need each other. We have, this morning there was said, we need to be open to multidisciplinarity. Conservators-Restaurers have been multidisciplinary from the beginning. It is in our ADN. We don't need to be open to that. We are already that. It's that we need each other, we need the crafts, we need so many other professionals around the discipline of conservation restoration, but we have to be clear about the boundaries, and this is defined by the competencies, and there has been a lot of written about that in the last decade.
Yeah, thank you. I think that touched on many aspects, and I think it's very important about the multidisciplinarity. Moving forward, the training that we all do is at a high level and is established to create jobs to deliver for the profession. So we wanted to touch on what is the potential for jobs in each of the regions that we are representing here. So Satish, maybe you can start that.
Well, India is home to over 1,200 museums, and majority of them, particularly private museums, have developed in the last 2 decades. So museums, in both public and private, are a major employer of our students. Besides that, art galleries and archives are potential employers, but a large number of students find employment in private practice. And because contemporary art market has very high demand in India, the private practice conservators are quite in demand, and therefore majority of students after they graduate join private practice conservators who are already practicing in the field. So this is where the potential job scenario is. Recently, all the public museums are controlled by the Ministry of Culture, and recently Ministry of Culture has taken initiative to ensure that these museums have, have avenues to employ all these trained students, not only in conservation, but also in museology, art history, archaeology, and other disciplines.
I think that's very important to have a field of professional status where the students are moving towards. And Maggie, in your Nation Young course, where are your graduates going?
What is very interesting is that like I said, this is only the 5th year, and we take about 8 to 10 students maximum a year. And so far, all of them have been employed, but not in national museums, because the government, we don't have the government buy-in yet. Where most of our, with the exception especially from the people from Namibia and Lesotho, was sent to us by their government museums. So they're employed in museums. But most of our other students goes to galleries, to auctioneering houses, or private museums. And except the ones, and I think the only ones not employed is the ones who are continuing with a PhD. So we're actually very proud of what we already accomplished in the 5 short years of the program, but we realize this is not closely enough to service the need in Africa. So, and I'm going to be naughty and take an advertisement break, because we just received, ICOM just received a solidarity grant for conservation training in Africa. And we hope over the rest of the year to roll out a training program across the entire Africa for very basic topics. But my long-term dream is this might be a foundation for us to in future create centers of excellence so that we can accelerate training without everyone having to come and do a master's degree with us.
Yeah, thank you, Maggie. It was a good advert break, thank you. Luis, you mentioned that the field was a little stronger earlier in Brazil. Is there a dip and an ebb? Is there still a very high interest for graduates and to get jobs in the museum sector or in freelance world? Yeah,
when they think about conservation restoration and the way our students are working, or the way the field is evolving, we have very different collections, not just museums or archaeology. We have also lots of objects within the archaeological because of the what we call archaeology of contract, industrial heritage as well, scientific heritage, ethnographic objects. I think that we still, dealing with the way the field was stronger in terms of the professionals who used to get together. We've never, because of the fact, for example, since 2008, we have 4 undergraduate courses. We've never had a national meeting of the conservation restoration students. So we still have a long way to go, but we are working on that. But I think that in terms of what we really need to face, all of the political situation that we are living, not just in Brazil, but in the whole world now, is that the people, our students, they have to be openness towards cultural diversity. Because as long as they are trained on this, as long as they know how to respect and to give value, then the field of conservation restoration will be much, much open because of the diversity of objects and beliefs and so on. That's something I was going to a little bit talk to Laura about. Europe has many courses, 42 belong to Encore. Is there still room for graduates in the field?
Well, again, I'm sorry for repeating, it depends, change from country to country. There are countries where the graduates directly finishing go to the market, to museums, to institutions, because it all depends on the number of the graduates you put, as you were saying. And now we're speaking about the Spanish case. We have so many different programs, both in the universities and in the schools, and it is true that in some areas the market cannot absorb all the professionals we are putting in the market, and this is something that some countries have to review and improve. What I was this morning also questioning myself is that if we have room for all the different diplomas we are commenting here, or if this can contribute to devaluate the market, which can be, at least from, again, speaking from the Spanish reality, the market it's having all those people applying for the very little positions we find. It creates some sort of devaluation of the positions. And this also brings us in connection to what was Luis commenting, is that what the market demands, and we have been for so many years thinking that we should go for more specialized professionals, so looking for people specialized in very little aspects and going in depth, and probably the changing reality now is demanding professionals that are a more flexible training and can adapt to the new needs, but also that are not focused on a single material. But this is also tricky because it also depends on who do you talk to. If you are talking to people in museums and research centers, they want very highly specialized professionals. which are a very in-depth perspective of what they are studying, of what they are treating. But the reality of the freelancers, of the people with private companies in the market is completely different, because some of them, they tell you that they have to survive, but that is the expression they use. And having to survive means having to deal with all different types of multimaterial art objects. And for us, from the educational perspective, the design of the training programs, we are now in this inflection point of what should we do, in terms of where should there be specialization in the bachelor, in the master, in none of them. And we should, I take the opportunity to say that we will have a conference on that in the coming year, because it's really tricky right now, and we really need to form the people according to the market needs.
I was going to say, would you like an advert break? And explain a little bit more about your conference next year.
Yeah. Well, we are still drafting it,
Oui,
but
this
should be the call very soon, and we will make to draft the topics very clear, because it can be a relevant for me. It's a very important moment where there have been so many things going on. There is also the charter project going on, a blueprint project. There is Susan Core here today, so probably she will be able to provide a better insight than me. But in the last year, there have been so many developments, and the reality now in the study programs is completely different to what was 5-10 years ago. This is we need to rethink and define and check if what we designing in terms of those competencies that was mentioned, those skills, that knowledge that we decided that was crucial for the different levels of the training are still valid, or need to be rethinked or improved or changed or reapproached in a different way. And it will be a relevant conference, I'm sure.
Oh, thank you. Luis, what about in Brazil? Do you need generalists or specialists? What are the competencies that are needed in your region?
I think we still train the students on a more specific, but it depends on the courses, because, for example, it depends on the history of how the training was developed. For example, if you think about the Secor, which is where I am, we have a very long tradition on polychrome sculpture, paper, and paintings, which is the traditional one. Even, I would say more, too much bound on colonial heritage. If you go to Rio, their course was born within an art history department. So, genetically, I would say, they have another tendency to work on other issues. If you go to Pelotas in the south, they are at the same very department as the museology course. So they have a much better condition to interact between conservation training, conservation restoration training, and museology studies, because they are under the same department. We, in my university, if we cross the street, it's one separation, a physical separation between conservation, restoration, and museology, but we don't interact much. And if you go all the way north, they were born within a faculty of architecture, but they do work now on integrated heritage and movable heritage. So I think it's a matter of recognizing your own influences and then evaluating what your region needs. Because of course the difference between the needs in Rio compared to the needs in the Amazon, it's a very big country. So we have to look at the big picture, but keeping an eye on the local questions as well.
Maybe Satish, you might have a similar situation.
Yes, we do. We normally, because we are only training institute, offering formal degree in conservation in India, we normally train a generalist. We do not have, scope to train specialists, because it's a kind of moral understanding that if we choose one particular material, what will happen to the other types of material if we are not training anyone in that material. So we train generalists, and as it is a 2-year program, we are always hard-pressed to train, to teach more in less time. And because of that, our focus is mainly on grounding students into ethical and philosophical concepts, theoretical knowledge in terms of science, materials, their behavior, the artistic practices. And in the second year, we try and focus them on, them developing hands-on skills, which is always not possible to train them enough to have, expert hand in all these skills. Whereas, we understand that it is important to train them in decision making. So if they understand how materials behave, if they understand what materials they can use and they cannot use, we believe that they would end up making ethical and informed decisions. And therefore, we leave them after the course to practice and develop hands-on skill a little more when they are in the profession.
And Maggie, your university had maybe the luxurious position of deciding what to teach. Can you explain how you came to the decision for the materiality that you teach there?
Yes, exactly the same as Satish said. We can't really afford to train specialists, A, because we don't necessarily have the skills, so we really try, but also B, nobody knows where they're going to work. So we really try and train generalists. And I come from a science background. I don't have a conservation training behind me. I'm a scientist. Alice fell down the rabbit hole and here she sits today. But there is value in that, because if we think about it, everything around us comes from something that was either grown or mined. And if you understand how to make a metal out of an ore, you know why that metal wants to become an ore again. And you know how to slow down the process and how to prevent decay. And that is what I'm trying to carry over to the students, that material science aspect, so that they can make informed decisions. But with their dissertation, we give them the freedom to choose whatever field they want to specialize in, and we bring in colleagues. So I'm always looking for volunteers. We bring in colleagues from wherever in the world as co-supervisors in their field. I just co-supervised a student together with medical faculty on wet specimen preparation and preservation, which is apparently a skill that's worldwide just about dying out, because everybody went to artificial intelligence and then realized, oops, it doesn't work that well. It's better to teach doctors on real specimens. So we do give them the freedom to follow their passion, but at the same time, we really try and keep it broad, ground them in the ethics and the decision-making skills, and ensure they don't walk out of there thinking they can suddenly go and restore the Mona Lisa. We really, really try and ensure that our students understand this is the first step of your career.
Maggie, that ties nicely into our last question, if we still have time. Lifelong learning. You just talked about the fact that your students will have to go through lifelong learning. What are the provisions for lifelong learning in Pretoria?
Well, this is one of the wonderful things. Because we don't have the local skills and we're a full faculty of 2, and then the third one is a PhD student, of course we don't have the skills ourselves to train every field. So I'm privileged enough to bring in specialists from all over the world. And of course, when we get them to fly to South Africa, you want to make it worth everybody's while. So we try and then organize short courses for practicing conservators at the same time, through wonderful collaborations with people like Yale and a Fulbright Scholarship and the Mellon Foundation. We actually have long-term collaborations with people already who returns every year and work with some people every year, people who were already finished studying 4 years ago, still attends every year and learn more from these specialists. And in that way, I mean, we have actually, by now, created a few people who are close to becoming specialists in their field.
Laura has encore a policy of encouraging universities to do lifelong learning, provide courses for those who are in the field.
Yeah, well, I mean, the reality in Europe that this is also part of the common practice for university, thanks to so many different, let's say, programs such as the Erasmus, and that facilitates not only the exchange for the students to take part in study periods in other institutions, but also placements for both also students and faculty. So it's let's say, I will say it's common practice that the students accept this idea of running periods of the training program, or have even compulsory credits allocated for running internships, both at the national level or even through these exchange international programs in other countries of the European Union, but also with countries external to the European Union, and it's extremely, extremely rich for them, and because it provides the perfect complement to the academic training, because the programs we cannot put more content sometimes into the program, so having these connections with the real life through placements in museums and institutions is the perfect complement for the training.
What about Brazil? Are there decisions made to push topics or subjects out of the courses because they're so full, and move them into a lifelong learning situation?
Well, I think I'm going to give a very personal perspective on this, because the way I see the field is developing now is, for example, if you compare with the medical sciences or the medicine, for example, we already have in some markets, in some cities, offering of services within, for example, specialized in documentation. So you have someone who was a former student of us and who's now only dealing with documentation of works of art. And we have, for example, there is a person in Rio, she trains people in conservation science. You know, that's what she does specifically. So these are like spots that we have, and then that's why I give my personal opinion. In my university, we have created what's called transversal training, where it's kind of open teaching activities to other than just our students. So we try to go into someone else's field, you know. And there are several areas where I think that our students and our future trained personnel, where they have to develop more concepts, like, for example, questions related to the territory, questions related to tourism, questions related to mining and sustainability. Mining is a problem all over the world, not just in poor countries, rich countries, and nowadays it's getting worse. So these are spots where, in terms of life, it's life training, it's not just lifelong training. It's life training for a long life. So that's how I see that we should go forward.
Thank you. And Satish, how do you see the future for the new generation in India?
Mid-career training or lifelong learning, as you put it, in India, I mean, we do not have very structured and organized or recurring training programs where one can come back to update their skills and knowledge. However, in the last 10 years or so, we have had a number of such avenues where people have, or conservators have benefited from those training avenues. And one such program was Indian Conservation Fellowship program, which was funded by the Indian Ministry of Culture and the A.W. Mellon Foundation, in which you were involved as a representative from SRAL. It was a collaboration with the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and the program ran for 6 years, 5 years of program, 1 year of pilot project. a number of, I think, over 50 conservators from India were trained as part of that program in terms of specific mid-career training program. Gail is here in the audience, and he has conducted, I think, more than 3 or 4 programs in India specific to reorg, trying to train Indian conservators in working with the museum storage. There are 2 specific funding avenues in India. One is called Charles Wallace Trust Funding, and managed by the British Council, and the other is Nehru Trust Fellowship, which offers short-term fellowship for Indian conservators to go to either the British Museum or Victoria and Albert Museum in London for specialized training in conservation if they wish to. So the avenues are increasing. However, as I said, there is, we feel the need of a recurring program in mid-career training within the country, and I think Indian Institute of Heritage is currently working on trying to develop a module in which we can provide a kind of mid-career training program to professionals who have been trained a decade ago and wants to update and learn their knowledge in the field.
Well, thank you. I think in this 45 minutes, we've touched on many topics and given different perspectives on that. And I think it just goes to show that there is not one definition, not one pathway. We have to be multidisciplinary and open to new ideas and new futures as well. So we'd like to invite the audience to pose some questions. Please, if you have a question. Oh, we will run out of time. No. Okay, after the second, third round table, we'll have questions. So thank you very much to the panelists here today.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you.
Questions? All right.
Yes, thank you. Whatever you want.
Nous allons passer à la table ronde suivante.
We shall now move to the next roundtable.
Je vais aller chercher.
Just a moment, please.
Qui sera modéré par David Cohen.
It will be moderated by David Cohen from the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota.
Qui comprendra un panel.
The panel will consist
Dans l'ordre. Par Salvador Muñoz-Viñas de l'Université Technique
First
de
of all,
Valence,
Salvador Muñoz-Viñas from the Universidad Politécnica de Valencia, Clémentine Bollard, a PhD student as well as a practitioner in contemporary arts at the Sergi Paris University, Politi Milokupolo, who works in the Byzantine and Christian Museum in Athens, and myself, Eleonore Kissel, head of the conservation section in the Musée du quai Branly.
Good afternoon for everyone and welcome on this round table. We are going to talk about conservation practices and theories on the scope of the previous discussions we have this morning and on the previous round table. So we are really happy to be here, and thank you so much for receiving us to talk about this. I have one first question I want to address first to Clementine. And we have seen the whole day that after 40 years of professional definition, many practitioners around the world, I mean, we have seen in Brazil and in South Africa as well, and also here in France, they have different kind of practices and legal protection, working on different collection-based institutions, not only museums, but also libraries and archives as well. So I want to know first from you, how is the conservation restoration practice from your perspective right now?
Merci David. Alors je vais faire une réponse qui va être peut-être un peu...
Thank you very much, David. I'll give you a rather general answer for a start, which will be based on my own experience and my own practice as a conservator-restorer in this specific domain of contemporary arts collections as well as industrial heritage. To define my own practice, maybe a few people will recognize themselves in this. It seems to me that the evolution of this profession of the last 50 years, the methodological, technical construction with the code of ethics, this skill reference scheme, have been some form of self-regulation on a voluntary basis. And on my side, the need is very much felt for the limits of the profession to be recognized by people outside of the profession. So it should no longer be just a definition among peers, but also used by other people we interact with. Simply because many cultural goods of many types, when we see the diversity of what is considered as cultural heritage nowadays. So many of these cultural goods are tackled from very different skill sets, very different perspectives. So we need the limitations of our profession to be well defined so that we can account for the fine lines between our professions and others. When we work on contemporary art, we need to work with the artists themselves, with delegate producers, with electromechanicians. And a conservator-restorer might have a role that will consist in coordinating the project, having the possibility of interacting with different, very various actors. So we need to integrate the large diversity of profiles in order to move forward.
Thank you. You talk about limits, which is good, but also these boundaries are really pushing away. So I don't know if somebody else wants to complement Clementine's answer, maybe you, Professor Salvador, about what's going on in Spain.
We have a number of situations. It depends. I started working in conservation as in a library as a paper and book conservator, and there I soon discovered that there was a huge number of possibilities when it comes to the general activity of conservation. So I was requested to supervise the storage area, to check whether or not there were some pests, or to check the relative humidity, to repair a tear in a book, to renew a book binding, to check the policies for accession to the books, the valuable ones, the less valuable ones, and the activity. I discovered that the activity of conservation is not the same as the profession of the conservator. Nowadays, there are people who are specializing in preventive conservation. In the institute where I work, half of the institute is composed by architects and engineers. So the situation is very varied because I touch the things I work with, other people don't, and all of us call ourselves conservators. In the library where I used to work, now some librarians are doing the less complex work, and also, I mean, what I want to transmit is the idea that setting a precise boundary is not easy in our field, and I think this will come up later. But with intangible cultural heritage on the rise, we are bound to face a huge challenge when it comes to determine what makes for a professional conservator. Because, I mean, we can no longer say, well, the conservators are people who touch, who repair things. We are also requested to repair non-things, if I may say it this way. So, I mean, there is a challenge. I'm not actually answering about Spain. I'm
yes.
answering about...
In general terms.
Yeah, in general terms.
It's happening.
Yeah.
So, Politimi, you work with archaeologists, mainly, and archaeological materials. And as Salvador was saying, working with other professionals means that the decision-making process, sometimes it's really a little bit difficult. It's not easy to set these kind of boundaries and limits. So I want to ask you first, because conservator-restaurators are often part of huge, broader teams of professionals. What can you say about the relationship between conservation professional and other professionals as part of the decision-making process?
Thank you, David. First of all, I want to thank the French Fédération of Conservateurs-Restaurateurs and Competencies, and of course our host, Musée de quai Branly, pardon, ma Française. And I think that something that is very important, and it is mentioned in previous roundtables, is where conservators are trained in a multidisciplinary context. We know that we have to collaborate with different professionals in order to achieve our goals. And I think that nowadays there are most often occasions that we have to be in a team. That's something it wasn't very often in previous years, but now I think we find ourselves many times to be in groups, committees, and other occasions with other professionals to decide about different topics. I think that, of course, the conservator-restorer opinion is taken very seriously in account, where we are talking about the way of conserving objects and treatment proposals, and particularly after or in countries that this profession is regulated, and there is a strong legislation about conservation, restoration, and the protection of cultural heritage. So I think this is easier for us in this case to collaborate and to have our opinion. I think also that is nowadays that is quite often to be in a scientific group about working for European projects or scientific projects generally. is also the conservator's opinion, depending the theme of the project, is taken in account. What is maybe more tricky is when we have a group of people that they are coming from different level of hierarchy, because we have to admit that conservator-restorers are not usually at the top of the management positions. They are not all, in most of the cases, directors. But I think also this is something is getting better. We have to work on it, for it, and try to get more conservators in a high level of managerial and in managerial positions. And generally, I think that it is something that it helps us also to collaborate, and we also have to find our way, and maybe, like in other professionals, improve our soft skills in order to achieve what we want to, particularly in more difficult situations that we may have to communicate our ideas, negotiate, and be more creative in order to get where we want to for our projects or objects. Thank you.
Does anyone have a reply for this answer? Want to complement this answer? I know it's a difficult one, but because, for instance, in Colombia we have the regulated profession, but a lot of professionals don't work on museums, and depends on the position. You cannot take this position being conservator. You need to have a different background. So it's always a kind of tension between decision-making process and conservation, restoration for professionals there. So I guess for the sense I got on the debate this morning with this huge, really philosophical questions about the definition of the profession, that it's something else happening here in France. So maybe one of you want to talk a little bit more about this?
Moi, je peux peut-être ajouter.
Well,
je pourrais pas répondre à l'intégralité.
I won't be able to answer the entire question because, as we said this morning, 75% of the profession is self-employed in France. So there is a specific approach where, we offer solutions, but we're not the decision makers. So we have an influence. We can try to get the results that we want. But at the end of the day, the collections managers are making those decisions. And then, of course, ideally, the context of a research project is better because the organization is more horizontal and there's more dialogue between specialists. And then I would also add that this doesn't apply to organizations that have a conservation restoration department. Perhaps that Eleanor would like to step in, which is that in those cases, the decision-making process is different when you're part of that kind of a department.
Yes, I think it is different. I was a freelancer for 20 years before I came into quai Branly, and it is by essence a different process when you have clients and when you have a hierarchy, of course. But the difference is not so much, I felt at least, as when I was a freelancer, in whose voice is going to have the greatest impact. I think the difference is mostly in continuity. When you are within a cultural institution, you can, as a team, and half of them are there, you can bring a continuity. You can have a long-term preservation strategy. You can actually write it down. You can look at it from afar 20 years later or 10 years later saying, oh, we wrote this in 2018, we should really revise this. But there is an archive. there's a body of information that will enable our successors to know why we took the decisions we took when we took them. And that's highly different, very different than from the situation in which you are delivering something to a client, even if you are if your opinion is very highly respected and heard.
Yes, it's true. And also it's true that the overview of our profession is getting complex because we have new theories about the heritage, about the values assessment, and about how the heritage, cultural heritage, is defining itself, and how it works together with natural heritage and intangible heritage as well. So I want to keep this question with you, Eleanor. And, you know, there are kind of materials and collections, like ethnographic collections, that have this more on the surface, this kind of interactions between types of heritage. So I want to know, how do you think conservation, restoration is contributing to push these limits of the conception of heritage?
I was lucky enough that David gave me this question beforehand, so I was able to prepare it a little bit, because there are quite a few concepts in David's question, and the first one was the fact that we're dealing with new theories, which is true in the sense that there are paradigmatic shifts that we can see. However, I just wanted to pay an homage to the people who actually brought forth these new theories, which are, it seems to me now, quite at a level of maturity. In my own field, or at least the field that I practice here, which is ethnographic collections preservation, women like Myriam Clavier or Nancy Odegaard or Landis Smith or Sabine Cotte were really pioneers in developing the way in which we work today. And the way they did that is by leading us to see how our heritage becomes wider, which is what you were mentioning and what we were discussing earlier about intangible objects, intangible heritage coming to the forefront. We went from objects to collections to buildings. We went from cities and sites to cultural and natural landscapes, and we went from tangible things to largely intangible heritage. And even in a museum like this one, which is a building with a collection of nearly 400,000 objects, intangibility makes eruption in our lives every day, because this is a place in which living cultures are presented. And these living cultures force us to shift the way we work, because we don't work so much with material objects as we work with cultural entities. It's that kind of shift that has a very deep impact in the way in which we work as conservators. And in terms of pushing the limits, our answer is that this intangible heritage, the culture with a large C, if one might, it is very often grounded in material things. And this is what we do as conservators. This is where we can contribute. And in a very, very wide range of situations, you don't work as a conservator in the same way if you're in Paris or in Jakarta or in Alaska. It depends if you're in a rural area, if you're in a city area, if you're in a country with a democratic policy, or a country which is closing itself up in a more autocratic political system, whether your population is young or aging. Climate change is impacting. So some of these parameters that are changing are global, some are more regional, but they all impact conservators in the fact that they must work in the paradigm in which they are. Conservation is a situated, from an anthropological point of view, action, activity. And the need to adapt to each situation is the way by which we push the limits of our own profession. And I say it like that.
Yes, that's true. From preventive conservation perspective, I think that conservators, we think we work with objects, but actually we work with people. Somebody do these objects, and somebody wants to preserve these objects as well. So in Colombia right now, many ethnographical museums are integrating living communities, indigenous communities, into the decision-making process. And they are claiming their rights, in some cases with some collections. But communities, stakeholders, and publics are increasingly demanding participation into these kind of decisions and processes. But it means for us that we must know how to work with people. But we don't know how to do that. Many of us do that because of our working experience, our trajectories, whatever, but we don't have training in working with people. So I have this question, this final question for Salvador. And it is about what is the role, do you think the role of the communication skills that we need into the learning process for conservators?
Okay, we also discussed this before, and I have tried to come up with some smart answer, but the short answer is I don't know. I don't know. I don't know because there is only a limited amount of available time to teach. And so if you teach, I don't know, negotiation or I don't know, persuasion skills, okay, then you will not be teaching, I don't know, the chemistry of cellulose or I don't know how to prepare this or that adhesive. So the short answer is I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how it can be done. But I know it is important. Let me just make some precision to your what you said. I think we conservators. I'm a hands-on conservator. I mean, I touch things, and yeah, you know, I smell acetone. You know, the kind of. And I work with objects for people, and people working in the intangible heritage field work for people with people. But my first field of action is the object. Then I need to work for the people. And then the second thing I can say about this, it is important to bear people in mind when making decisions. But the super huge problem we conservators face is that we cannot simply go out and ask people what they like, what they want, or well, the problem is we are also working for people who have not been born yet. Mm-hmm. And that's a problem. We cannot ask them about what they are going to prefer. So we need to make a educated guess and cross fingers and hope that they will like what we have decided. But that role, the role of the people who have not been born yet, who's going to play that role? I would say that that's a beautiful part of the conservators' field of authority, so to speak, epistemic authority, if you so want. But yeah, it's not only the people who are around us. It's much more complex. So
yes, it's a really much more complex, and also you know, with all this decision-making process. Because sometimes the people who decide is not trained in conservation, or they don't even care about conservation of collections, or they are not thinking about the future people. That's why. I don't know if Polly wants to talk a little bit more about this topic?
About the people. I love to, yeah. I think it is a challenge for us because conservators used to be in their cell in the lovely workshop and lab, and then suddenly they had to deal with people, that not only objects. So I think it's a huge challenge, but not only about the decision-making of conservation, but being in contact with people and try to train them, to make them understand. And I believe that conservation is very fascinating for non-professionals. You can do a lot of things with conservation and the public. You can be more inclusive. You can create bridges. So it's not only, we shouldn't see that like they have to be involved in something that we thought they shouldn't, or they were used not for many years not to be in this sort of decision making. I think we should be more open and try to communicate what we do and be more, take the public with us. And I think they really, really enjoy it. Every time I have this experience, the feedback from people visiting conservation workshops or listening to conservation is always very positive. Thank you.
I have great faith in our profession, and the reason for that is because the essence of what we do is transmission. We are obsessed with transmission, sometimes to a point of being a little bit absurdly blinded by the final objective. But it is because we want to transmit something, a thing or a culture in its intangible sense, that we hold a scalpel and that we glue things and that we try to attempt that they are not eaten by pests and damaged by light. But the fact that we are our work is so much grounded in transmission, I think reaches out to transmission of know-how, competencies, knowledge. We are quite adept, I think, at transmitting competencies to people who come to work with us. And we are quite adept at transmitting what ignites us as conservators when we deal with the public and society in general. I think if the voice of the conservator is not heard much, it is because we are a small profession. You have one conservator for tens of thousands of doctors, of plumbers, of lawyers. And so it's difficult to have a voice that's heard. But we do that quite well, I think.
Clémentine, do you want to close this before we start with the questions?
Peut-être que je peux juste ajouter, je rejoins ce que disait Salvador.
I completely agree with what Salvador was saying earlier, which is when you have a 5-year program, and Maggie was saying this earlier today as well, even 5 years is too little, actually, to be trained. 2 years is little, so is 5 years. There's so much to learn, and I agree with Eleanor on adaptability and our potential. And that's also part of our code of ethics, trying to explain what we do, communicate about what we do. I also think that when we're faced with an issue, we need to go seek out the people we need. If we don't have a specific skill, maybe we could go ask a specialist, cultural mediators or people who know how to disseminate knowledge. Maybe sometimes we're just too caught up in our own jargon, and we should turn to other people too. Thank you.
That's it. So thank you very much. And now we want to open the floor for the questions from the public. So if anyone wants to interact with this roundtable, it's welcome.
Et ça vaut aussi pour les personnes qui, voilà, si vous avez des questions concernant la
And of course, if you have questions to the speakers from the previous roundtable, please feel free.
I want to ask the public to please stand up because it's really difficult to see who is asking from here.
Hi, Luis Souza, Federal University of Minas Gerais. I wanted to have your opinion on the question regarding if it's an academic or if it's a practice. Because, for example, we at the university, we need to develop the concept that we are an academic field of research, that we can then access funding, which is normally given to other disciplines. So I wanted to have your experience on this.
Any one of you works at the university?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, and it's always the same. I mean, you have to do research to fundraise and to, fulfill these quotes from the academic world, because you have to publish, you have to prove your research results, but also you have to give back a little bit for the public, the general public. So this year, the Research Council of Colombia and the university approved different kind of research products related with conservation that are not, the scientific paper, which is okay, but will not reach the public we want to reach with our research and with our work. Because, yes, we can publish in English, but I want people who talk Spanish to get closer to their collections or their research. So, by fortune, we have this change. So now, some research products are recognized as research results, not only academic papers. I don't know how it's going on now.
No, it doesn't work like that in my environment. I work in paper conservation and in conservation theory, and they know that to get funding, I always have to present a project that deals with some technical issue in paper conservation. Conservation ethics or philosophy, that's difficult. As I remember Stefan Michalski once saying, it's difficult to think in committee. And perhaps, it makes sense that, it's more difficult to get funding for a team of people making philosophy. Yeah, so,
I don't know if anyone wants to add something to this question? Oh, it's okay.
I think it's everywhere the same about the academic.
Gaël de Guichin, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, I'm Gaël de Guichin. I'm very concerned, actually, looking at the trends, because there's World Heritage sites in all countries, there's heritage in every country, conservation schools to train people who will preserve that heritage. There's very few of those at the global level. Now, in Europe, every country has training centers, but outside of Europe and North America, I think there are very few. In India, there's almost none. It's a huge country. In China, very few. Africa. I'm talking about sub-Saharan Africa. Again, very few, just one or two. And I think that they're not up to scratch or up to the standards. And if you look at Latin America, there was a boom in the 80s, 90s, Colombia. Almost all of these schools were in former convents that were turned into conservation restoration schools, and politically they were all shut down. In Brazil, now Lewis was telling us, you know, there's really not much given the size of the country and the fact that there's so few jobs. So that is of great concern to me. How can we meet the needs in all of these countries? How can trained professionals meet those needs? And in these countries which do not have the trained professionals that they so badly need, if these people get a scholarship to study abroad, if they go abroad, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're getting training. They're not getting trained, they're getting... Then... So INP, these other centers, they're not actually meant to train people from other countries and other cultures. They don't know the context, they don't know the specificities. So try as they might, when these people go back to their countries, they're not actually trained. And that is very serious. And they're given high-ranking positions based on their training, but very often they shouldn't actually hold those positions. And then what happens? Well, in those countries, these countries which need to preserve their cultural heritage, they call on European countries. And so now there is a policy supported by embassies, ministries. It's a policy to export knowledge. So a student, a young student or an old student like me, we export knowledge. Now, what I learned in France is applicable to France and Europe, but it's not applicable in other countries because I don't know those cultures. You know, it's not just a piece of wood, a piece of metal. These objects hold great significance. So, we send these trainers, and what do they do? And I think it's a form of neo-colonization. It's neo-colonization. We're imposing our ideas, our products, our ideas. So people who are being exported, sent out in this way, in my opinion, they're not sufficiently trained for that purpose. As a result, I think we're making a huge mistake, and that is of great concern to me. So that was just to draw a link between the two roundtable discussions that we've just heard. It is very, very concerning. So there are countries that are importing, but at the end of the day, this is basically a hodgepodge. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question before we go to the lunch break. Oh no, the coffee break, sorry.
Pierre Levaux. I was a speaker this morning. No, I think that Gaël didn't get a response to his question, but perhaps I can offer something as well. So this neo-colonization means that we are exporting these concepts and methods which are not always applicable in these various countries, which also don't have the same resources, and so we are a neo-colonizer. But, you know, I also speak to my students who are thinking quite a lot about intangible cultural heritage, and they think, can I restore a piece of cultural heritage if I'm not from that culture? And so the students that I work with, they say, I'm interested in this culture, but should I convert to that culture before I restore their heritage? And these are questions that I'm facing, and I think they also exist in the world of cinema. You know, where we hear that you can't play a particular role if you're not a part of that community. So, you know, our code of ethics is based on universalism that can be interpreted as neo-colonialism or universalism. And so we see this countercurrent coming back in intangible cultural heritage, which is the property of those who inherit it. But this does raise issues for conservator-restorers, because it's a new market in a way, and it may require new values and perhaps new skills. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe intangible cultural heritage is not meant to be restored, but just preserved, which is different. And so this is basically just a response to Gaël's question, and I also wanted to get your point of view. And you know, Eleanor works with ethnological heritage. And sometimes it's about returning heritage. And even in Athens, when you work in a religious museum, do you have to be Christian? Do you have to be Byzantine? So these are questions that my students are asking. Thank you.
I think that no binary answer can ever be given to a complex question. And both your questions or remarks are highly complex. As far as intangible heritage per se is concerned, I'm not sure we as conservator, we have a foot in the door because we will prevent from damage and make conservation treatments of objects that are part of the way in which intangible heritage expresses itself. Whether it is a musical instrument or a cooking gear or a motorcycle or whatever it is, a book, an archive, we are conservators of tangible goods which will be used and will manifest themselves in the broader framework of intangible heritage. But I think the essence of intangible heritage is its fluidity, the way in which it is constantly evolving because it is lived heritage. And therefore, yes, there are all these issues of cultural appropriation, which is what you were referring to, and the questions you are being asked by students, Pierre, we are being asked the same questions as well in the museum. But the reason why I was saying that it's not a binary answer, it's not we are engaging in a neo-colonialism through training, for instance, or no, we will forbid ourselves through self-censorship from working on an African mask or an Indonesian puppet because we are not Malian or Indonesian or initiated, or because I am a woman, or because I am menstruating, all these taboos that are associated with dealing with cultural heritage, and I'm speaking here more about tangible cultural heritage, as a conservator, because you are not part of the culture that created it. The only answer lies in this dialogue that I was positing earlier. The fact that conservation is situated as an activity, it also means that it has its share of subjectivity and opportunity. I will engage with representatives of a source community regarding the conservation of Northwest Coast basketry if I can speak to the weavers who actually today, as Haida women, make basketry. Incidentally, this is what we're going to do next week. But sometimes I just need, the museum needs as an institution to put an object on exhibition, and the calendar, the funding, the opportunity will simply not arise for me to reach out to a community in Colombia in order to discuss the way in which this particular object might be cared for and or conserved in its community of origin or country of origin. And therefore, we're just going to do what we know how to do, which is try to engage in treatments that enable retreatability, be as respectful as we can as the original materials, read a lot, inform ourselves as best we can, be prudent in our approach, but at the end of the day, we are not going to put ceramic in 6 parts, 6 fragments in a showcase because we haven't had access to descendants of the source community who produced it, maybe 400 years ago. So we try to find a balance between what is possible, what is what we should strive for, and in terms of neo-colonialism and trying to limit ourselves in this sense, we try to think hard about what we do. For instance, in this museum, there is a strong push for modifying our climate control set points so that in international loans we are not as stringent as we have been for the past 50 years, so that it becomes possible to loan something to a community museum in the heart of the Amazon, which is up till now something which might have been difficult. But you know, you work within a paradigm, and the paradigm here is a French national public collection in a country which is secular. And that's what it is. And if I were working with the Shuar in Shuar country, it would be a different paradigm. And this is the pushing the limits and the adaptability that we must have as a profession. Otherwise, we're just not doing our job.
Okay, thank you so much to everyone, and just go for the coffee break and see you here at 4:15. Thank you so much.
Ok, on va reprendre.
Let's resume this session.
Nous allons commencer la deuxième moitié de cet après-midi par une troisième et dernière table ronde.
We start the second part of this afternoon session with the roundtable on one size fits all, the need for a tailored definition of the conservator, with Stephanie de Romer at the moderation, who works at the University of Cambridge Museums.
Patricia Engel, University for Continuing
As a panelist, we'll have Patricia Engel from the University for Continuing Education in Krems, Laurie Ron from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, and Renata F. Peters, UCL London.
Hello and welcome, and I also want to just say a big thank you to the organizers of what I think is a really stimulating and wonderful discussion and event. It is the last roundtable for today, the last opportunity for the discussion. I have been scribbling down a lot of notes, so I do apologize if, and especially to my panelists, because I might have done some switches with pre-discussed questions. But the session, one size fits all, a need for a tailored definition of the conservator. I just would like to say, from today, I think what I really got from it is that conservation seems to be sometimes a little bit of an area of paradoxes. So we have the personal versus the professional or the general. We have the specialist skill versus the broad skill set that seems to be required. We have the scientist versus the arts. We have the conservation discipline, specific, very material specific, in contrast to preventive conservation. And we have theory and practice. We have philosophy and experience. And I very much liked Eleanor's comment about balance. So this is something I maybe like people to bear in mind. And it just leads me to how do we square this circle or the circles of this interdisciplinary and diverse nature of conservation, of cultural heritage into a linguistic or a semantic definition. So I think this is to set up what we maybe want to explore. Is it possible? And I would like to ask a question to all three panelists here. And Laurie, if you don't mind, I start with you. Thinking of your own practice and experience with your professional and public environment, how do you introduce yourself in regards to what you do, or how do you define your practice work in the field?
Thanks, Steph. And good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy to be here this afternoon with all of you. So I guess that question for me is never an easy one. And I like how you talk about square and circles. And I often feel I am a square peg that doesn't fit into the round hole as a conservator. So number one, I feel like I shouldn't even be here in the first place. I am a Chinese American. I should be a doctor. I should be in finance. I should not be a conservator. So that's the first point. I somehow managed to find my way into conservation as an art historian and as a studio art graduate. So these are the two things that went hand in hand for me, which led me into the field of conservation. And I think that's important, I think, for me in terms of what I actually ended up studying. I studied at the Courtauld. I don't know if this is what you want, but I think it kind of defines how I see myself, or how maybe I try to tell people what I do. I trained in the UK. I studied wall painting conservation, so this is another example where square peg round hole, because I work in built heritage and I am part of the International Council of Museums. So that is always something that has always not been clear to me about how somebody who works in built heritage as a conservator actually fits within the museum world and museum space. For 20 years, I worked as a practical conservator with the Getty Conservation Institute. I recently moved into academia, and I now teach at the Courtauld, so I've gone full circle, and a couple of my colleagues here from the Courtauld are here. So the course I now teach on is very different. I teach on a course that focuses on Buddhist heritage. It is a one-year MA program. It is not a practical conservation program. So I've kind of moved a little bit away from practice. So I have a hard time defining what my role is. I have a hard time defining what it means to be a conservator. And I think this is the topic that has come up time and time again. I do not think there can be one definition, which is why we all have been struggling with it. I think if we as conservators can't come up with that definition, there's a reason for it. And perhaps there shouldn't be just one definition. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll hand over to the rest of the panelists.
Well, thank you very much, Laurie. And this is exactly, I think it just shows again, even the training of a conservator and training, what does that even mean? It can be so varied. We not necessarily in the country where you were born. So I think it's all just really adding to that complexity. Renata, the same question to you.
Okay, yeah, I was dreading you were going to give me the surprise question. So, yeah, we still have that, right? Okay, so the way that I introduce my practice depends on where I am and who I'm talking to and what I want to get out of that conversation or what I think is possible with that conversation. And there are many reasons for that. The first is that as a conservator, so just to make a parallel to what Lauren was saying, so I am a trained artist who worked as a teacher for many years and then trained in conservation later in life. And I'm an academic now, and I have been an academic for about 20 years. But at the same time, I'm also a researcher who works with indigenous peoples in the Brazilian Amazon, which is my home country, by the way. And a third aspect of my profession as a conservator is that I am an archaeological conservator. So I work in the field with archaeologists, and we have this long-term project in Olduvai in Tanzania. So those are quite different practices, let's say, that demand different kinds of knowledge, different kinds of skills, but that, ironically or not ironically, right, I also have a lot in common, right? So, well, so this is not a very straightforward answer, right? So I'm just justifying why it's not straightforward. But the second reason for it not being very straightforward is that I think conservation is quite complex. So the term, and like Lauren said, I am one of those that don't think that we should have only one definition, because one definition is probably not going to be good enough for every context where you're working. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, maybe. But anyway, I find conservation to be quite complex because it's a cross-disciplinary profession, it's layered, it's relational. I understand it as a process of knowledge production where the conservator is constantly involved in a recursive method going through questions and investigations to find out what objects are, what they have been, what they can be, who is related to them, and so on. Another important point that I would like to highlight here for this complexity, and this has come up in the previous talk, is that in my understanding, you cannot separate tangible from intangible the way that I understand things and the way that I work. I believe that when you only look at tangible, when you only look at materiality, you have a limited understanding of what you're trying to conserve. So you have to go beyond that, right? And for that, I need to highlight something that's really important that also came up in the previous panel, which was the importance of communication. And by communication here, I mean communication with your colleagues, obviously, but also with different interest groups related to the material that you are trying to conserve, and the audiences, right? So the public that you're trying to do that for, that at the end is going to, is also very important. So going back to the original question, yeah, I will introduce myself according to the context where I am and according to the person I'm talking to and what I think that person can take. So I'm definitely not to go into the, oh, I believe conservation is a process of knowledge production, blah, blah, blah. If a taxi driver asks me what I do, so I will definitely simplify my question, but my answer, but try not to patronize the person I'm interacting with, because people are smart, right? So you just have to test the grounds, and then you can bring more complexity as you go. I'll stop here.
No, yeah. Thank you, Renata. And again, I think that's very interesting. That even, I think it alludes already to the difficulties of a one-size-fits-all, even on a very individual, personal level. Patricia, may I ask you the same question? And
yeah, thank you very much. I also believe that what one calls conservation is largely defined by his or her environment and cultural background and training and field of work. This in general, and for my person, I was trained as a conservator in Austria at academic level at the University of Fine Arts in the 1970s and 80s, and later continued my studies in Poland. In Vienna, we initially, and in a way indirectly, were involved in the international discussion ongoing on the topic of definitions during the studies, so I got this right from the beginning. We ourselves were trained starting with wooden sculpture conservation, easel painting conservation, and from the third to the fourth year, we were allowed to select other topics, other material. And I took three different fields, which was mural painting, glass and ceramics, and paper, graphic, and books. And later focused on the last. However, at that time, everything which did not fit the other offers in the study program, like metal paintings, music instruments, things like feathers, ivory, tortoiseshell, landed on the desk of the paper people. And so this gave me a good opportunity to understand what is conservation and what is the particular need of a particular material, right from the beginning. And also we were encouraged right from the beginning to go into research, to do teaching, to go into, to stay updated in the field, and also to publish, which is stay in communication with the others. What helped me as a general guidance was the theory by Branly, and I'm not going into that, but I only want to say that conservation is understanding. This is too short, and everybody knows it in the room. But this is a very good definition for Europe, the long one. However, I'm now involved since several years in building up the first university training for conservators in Indonesia. And my first thing was to push the Indonesian colleagues towards identifying a theory on which the practical work can base to find it for themselves, to identify it for themselves. Already asking them to do that was, to my mind, quite a European approach. I think there are several ways which could be used, but I'm also not going into this. System theory could be one, a huge task to draw all the trees you need to do in this theory building. Set theory could be another one, because it would highlight what is in common worldwide in the topic. Coming back to your question now, I'm working as a university for continuing education, as it was said before, as a researcher, senior researcher, and I'm working as a freelance conservator in Austria, and wherever they want me, but mainly in Austria. And it is a little bit like what you said. I mean, in general, people in Austria know what conservation is, and I should add the German word, which is Restaurator. And again, according when you read Branly, Restaurierung actually includes conservation, and Konservierung is, as a word, it is in German, it's canning fruits. Mm-hmm. And, so what I do is to explain to people, I say konservatorische Maßnahmen, which means conservatory measures, which is not good in English, but in German it indicates I'm not preserving fruit, but I'm doing something with cultural heritage. But in general, you need not explain, and if people have a wrong imagination, who cares? It's only if you want to speak with somebody who potentially wants to give you a request for conservation, then I start to explain. I explain how much I would suggest should be done, and then I often use the picture of the medical doctor, and in contrast to the craft. And I say the craft is rooted in a very old tradition, and it repeats the tradition. And the medical doctor looks at the individual and makes, in a certain framework, individual decision. And this is usually very clear to those to whom I explain. Yeah, this is, does it answer the question?
Oh yes, it's. Thank you very much. As I say, I think it really demonstrates already the difficulty of coming up with a definition. Even just asking someone, and maybe I can all invite you to think about what would be your definition. And I think this morning Gael demonstrated maybe the terror, the stress of having to come up with a succinct definition, yet at the same time, I think we also very clearly today got the impression how important a definition is, and maybe even also required in order to protect our profession. What is our profession? But there needs to be also something for a legal framework to provide that protection, which then determines the training, what kind of skills does a conservator-restorer need. I just wanted to mention, I believe in America, for example, it's more preservation. Preservation is often used as a word as well. I'm just thinking, you know, in terms of fruit Konservierung of food. But with all of this in mind, I really want to get on to the next question, which is a little bit of a provocation. I like to start with you now, Renata. Very simply, what is the problem of a definition?
What is the problem with the definition? Well, what is not the problem with the definition, right? It's more like a question. Well, we spent the whole day talking about that, so I don't have to say again that I believe it's difficult to come with a good definition. And I will say more. I will say that no definition is going to always work, or no definition is going to work forever. So I do believe that you need to be able to think on your feet and to adapt your definitions to specific situations, either because of the way you're working or the people you're working or the context or whatever. So it is quite difficult to come up with a good definition. And I think many people get very anxious about that, but I don't get anxious because I look at the other disciplines, you know. So I would ask you to try to define a concept such as art, you know. So how do you define art? Or how do you define science? Or a smaller discipline, let's say. So going back to my professional experience, if I work at the Institute of Archaeology, so if I go to my department and I ask the archaeologists, there are about 75 of them in there, and I ask them to define archaeology. You should believe me that they are probably going to discuss and argue for a whole day, and at the end, they may come up with different conclusions or not even come up with conclusions. So these definitions are difficult, and it is a good provocation. I totally agree with that, and I think everybody should take up the challenge of trying to define your practice or your discipline in different ways. Why am I saying this, emphasizing that it has to be in different ways? Because you have to engage with people, you have to engage other people in the practice of conservation, and this is not only to protect the profession, like it was well discussed in the morning. It's also because you want a space in the decision-making table. So if people don't know what you do, if you're not able to discuss, to explain what you do and what you can do for the different projects that you are involved in, you will not be a decision maker. So there are different reasons why we should work with that. And, you know, this has been discussed for at least 20 years, how we should try to raise awareness of conservation and all that. But it is difficult. Don't feel anxious, though, because just think about the other disciplines. You know, who has an easy task? Nobody has an easy task trying to define these big concepts or these practices. But there are other things to consider, I think, which is that when you define something, you have to establish limits, you have to establish differences, and this has also been talked about today. You have to make the difference between what you do and what a close colleague will do, who is not a conservator. And by doing that, what are you doing when you're establishing those limitations? You're excluding things. So that's one of the problems that I think, that when you're defining something, you're excluding things. What is more difficult, even, I would say, is the human side of that exclusion, that we have to acknowledge that when we're here at the quai Branly discussing all these really hairy concepts, a whole day to talk about that. It's really thought-provoking. I find it quite exciting. I'm quite excited to think about that. I hadn't, so I'm accepting the provocation and all that. But I think we have to acknowledge that we're doing that from a position of privilege. We're doing that from a position that implies power. And even though it is a position of privilege, position of power, it has blind spots. And the only way for us to be aware of those blind spots is by communicating with different kinds of people. So again, this has been discussed here today, so how we can engage with different interest groups or stakeholders of collections, and why we should take their views into account and so on. I think Eleonora made really good points about that today, so thank you, Eleonora. I totally agree with what you said today. And this has been done in many different countries, in different institutions, but it's not mainstream yet. And I think we should try to push it forward, so the need for better communication so that we can come out of this position of power and privilege better informed and informing better and conserving better, which is the aim at the end of the day. Sorry if I talked too much.
No, thank you, Renata. On that note, Laurie, I will put that question to you now. How then is maybe a definition that fits all, so summing all of these things up into one, or was it 5 sentences, I think I said this morning. How might that be a problem maybe of semantics or language or words for something that is in essence a practice?
Mm-hmm. Right, so I mean, I should say first of all, I really love terminology and definitions. I think it's really important, and so I want to emphasize that especially in my experience as a conservator in the field of built heritage, where we're always working in teams with architects, engineers, it's very clear to most people in the outside world what an architect does, at least roughly what an engineer does. I find most people do not know what a conservator does. So the definition, I think, is important, not just for all of us here in the room, but for the people who we work with. And I think it has been a major issue. So when I went to the UK, I became an accredited conservator because I can't do that in the US. So it gives me some sort of backing, some sort of understanding of what I do. The process itself I found very confusing because I felt like I had to fit, again, this kind of idea of a practice that didn't match at all my experience and how I have worked as a conservator. But to get to your question, Steph, I think the issue that I see sometimes with definitions are, and this is echoing what Renata has already said, is that, it can be somewhat limiting. It has that unintended consequence when we start to have to define what it is that we do. And again, it's a single definition that becomes a problem. So, I mean, the case where I work, I now teach on Buddhist heritage. It is, again, not practical conservation. It is an interdisciplinary program. It has to be. I co-teach with an art historian. We have to bring in Buddhologists. We cannot think about these objects in isolation. I cannot make a decision about what to do on an object, or even whether we should do anything at all, unless there is a discussion that can happen. And I fully acknowledge that is not easy to do. It is not, there is no guide to how to do that. But at least for us, when we're teaching in the UK on Buddhist heritage, these are mainly collections that have a very strong link to empire. They are objects that were never intended to be in a collection. And I know this will be very controversial to many people. But we have to address that. We have to think about the object and its object biography. We have to think also about not only its source community, but to who who it might still have value to today and possibly into the future. So a lot of what I try to teach is about context. It's about understanding how decisions have been made in the past and also how we are making decisions in the future. Because I think conservation is very much, it's a reflection of society. It's a reflection of socio-political events, of economic events. And we are here with the object today, but it's really just a small blip in the history of objects. So, you know, I also want to remember that. Remember our role is just one point of an object's history. So I don't know if I answered your question there, but...
You expanded on it, which leads me to Patricia, a question for you. You mentioned a medical doctor or comparison to, and we heard that a couple of times today. I sometimes, when I tell people what I do, I often say I'm like a doctor for objects. So I think the medical comparison we probably very often use. In terms of a definition, it just makes me think that the medical profession has a code of ethics, the medical code of ethics, and I believe that in most countries, conservation has codes of ethics and principle and practice. And just to maybe ask you, because you introduced that, to what extent is maybe such an ethical code more suitable or appropriate than maybe a definition?
Okay, I would like to answer to both aspects, the code and the definition. The definition not only very shortly, but the code first. I think an ethic action or ethic acting and thinking is something we strive for as a person and as a conservator. And we forward this by trying to work and to be ethically according to our understanding, which is also diverse in the world with some differences, something might be the same. And this is just seen by the child or by the student in conservation. So I think there is no need to really talk on it when you live it and others feel it. And yeah, if it is true, that's the one thing about the ethics, to my mind. Of course, it's also good to reflect on it, to see the history of ethics, to see the diversity of small differences in ethics in connection with cultural heritage. Therefore, we also think about it as conservators. The definition of the profession, for me, is a completely different thing. It is, to my mind, to protect the heritage, not the conservator. Because the conservator, to my mind, is an advocate of the heritage items or the heritage. And in Austria, and I can only speak about the countries I know, which is Austria and Germany. I worked also and lived for a long time in Germany. There, the word and the profession is not protected by law, and everybody can do whatever they think is conservation, as long as the owner allows it, which is, otherwise this is destroying something. And I think if we could, however, protect this wording, we would do good to the cultural heritage itself.
Thank you. I think that's also chimes with this morning, the comment made about it's not about protecting, I took a note of that, it's not about protecting the profession, but protecting the heritage. And I think in a way it's quite a nice, for me there is it's like a feedback loop in a way, because I immediately wrote down if then the profession isn't protected, is that not potentially a risk to the heritage? So I think there again there is an entwinement. I'm just aware of the time, and I just wonder if we do have some time for opening up. So we have some time for questions? Okay, so then I would just really like to invite any questions, comments. And again, if you stand up, maybe that just helps to...
Bonjour, Claire Bétellu, donc je suis restauratrice de peinture.
Good afternoon. I restore paintings. Yes, I'll be speaking French. And I'm also in charge of trainings in preventive conservation. Now, what you were saying earlier, Patricia, the fact that in some countries anyone can sort of intervene, step in, work on objects, and it was something we heard also in the first roundtable, and I think it's important to say that these are trained professionals. They have acquired specific skills, and specifically in France, and I think this may have been mentioned this morning, but I wasn't here, the fact of creating a framework of common competencies so that we can position ourselves as compared to other types of trainings in the arts and so on, in art history, in different heritage-related professions. But at the same time, so this framework for competencies could support professionals. It could help reflect their identity, the specificity of their know-how, their approach. So I think that's worth exploring. Or the training, whether it's 2, 3, or 5 years, we know that it's different from country to country. I think that should also be included in our reflection. We often forget as professionals that we have a lot of experience, and but the 4 or 5 years that we spend together with our trainers have a major role to play as we discover what our discipline is really all about. Thank you.
Patricia, would you like to say something, or shall we have another?
As I understand it, it was a confirmation to what I said. Yeah. Thank you.
David Queco.
David Queco.
Preventive conservator. Conservator. I'm very surprised that none of you never mentioned methodology. Ethics was finally mentioned, thank you for it. But methodology have not been mentioned, a specific methodology for conservation restoration, which I think is the common base of our work. How do we approach the object? Nor competence. Nobody mentioned competence, specific competences, to approach the object, to look at the object, to identify it. And the question of responsibility towards society. I mean, it's why we work, why we fear not to be recognized by society is that we have a very high responsibility towards the object and towards the people and the society. And if we're not recognized, if we don't have even a name, how can we be, how can we exert our responsibility? That's a question. But I'm surprised that there's no definition for you. And really. Well, I don't mention the fact there are definitions in Sen, in whatever, a lot of echo and so and so. Sorry. A bit frontal.
thank you. Do you want to get back to that?
Thank you very much for this question. I mentioned the theory, and the theory describes it really well. And I said that this was all my life the basis of my thinking, acting, decision making. And I said I don't go into details because I take for granted that everybody knows the theory. So I probably was too short on that. I'm sorry. But yes, it includes it all.
Yeah, can I go on?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, I will agree with you. It's because of the way of the specific questions that were asked from us. So we were not asked to give you a definition. We were asked how we explain what we do, and those are different things. But I think, so I just want to clarify here. So when I said that, I did give a kind of definition when I said that I understand conservation as a process of knowledge production in which we relate the tangible to the intangible in order to answer recursive questions, and these questions are related to methods. So of course, we could spend hours here talking about the methods that we use in conservation, but I'm sorry, but I didn't really think that that was necessary, like you said. But thank you for asking anyway, because then we can respond to that.
Thank you very much. Adrian Heritage, Cologne Institute of Conservation Sciences. I'm interested about the medical analogy because the 1984 text interestingly visualizes a surgeon, who was a he, by the way, and we've heard that 80% of conservators or conservator-restorers in France are female. But more to the point, this notion of surgeon, which I think is quite an old-fashioned notion. Of course, the skill in the hands, you think about that. But what about the progression of thinking about caring in society? What about the notion of our profession also being one of caring? We spoke briefly about Heidegger's view on this and about, Sorge, and about the high point of care having a purpose for society, being the highest purpose of society. I'd be interested about that because, for me, caring is sort of what can we learn about nursing? What we also learn, because it's hierarchical, of course, we like to think about maybe doctors. But if we're thinking about doctors, and I'm bringing in this medical analogy because it always seems to be made. It was made years ago, and it's still being made. But are we talking about doctors in Western medicine in their silos of disciplines? Or are we talking about functional medicine doctors? Or are we thinking about doctoring or fostering, caring? That's my question to you, whether you think we're actually a much wider, broader profession than just thinking of the surgeon.
Thank you very much. I just quickly want to say, I think that's really spot on. I wanted to say, I don't think we mentioned surgeon, we mentioned medical.
Exactly.
And not just surgeon. Yes. So we talked medical because specifically in contemporary art conservation and in, I think, also believe in anthropological collections and conservation, in recent years there have been publications exactly on networks of care and looking at conservation as a practice of care and in a much, much broader sense than what you described. But that's just one thing, and if I just want to pass on to the panel if you have to have a comment.
Yeah, may I? I said I talk to the people who want to put forward a request for conservation, explaining that an individual decision must be taken. And here I came to use the comparison with medical care. So it was very specific what I meant, in contrast to craft, because in Austria, in some of the craftsman description, conservation is included. And therefore, I make this distinction and say, no, the conservation I offer is not this, but that.
I really like the idea of a broad view of the fields, because I think so often it has really been focused on materiality, the tangible side of things, and that we've gone into a lot of discussion on that already. I think this idea of care is really important. I also think there's many ways to care for objects. There are many ways that objects have been cared for well before this modern discipline of conservation came into being. I think one issue I've always thought about is this 1984 definition. Who was part of that process? What were the objects, the heritage that people were thinking about when that definition was formed? And it's no criticism of that. I think that 1984 definition was so important and so groundbreaking and crucial to the field. But 40 years on, should we now be rethinking this? It falls in line with what our French conservator colleagues are already trying to do, because I do think the field has changed. I do think how we have portrayed ourselves in the past might need to be looked at differently. I always come back to this idea of who are we doing this for? Why are we doing this? And I don't know, maybe it's just me, I've had this existential crisis as a conservator. And in terms of methodology, to answer the question, I always say I follow a values-based approach to conservation. It's very vague, but for me that is the best way to think about it, because how I would have conserved things 20 years ago is not the same as how I would do it today. And I don't know if I'm alone in that, but I feel like the field is evolving, and how we engage with objects for people who value them, the public, whoever it is. I mean, these are things that we need to be thinking about, because our actions do have consequences. They can change the future of the object.
And just before we move on, Renata, do you?
No, just add something to what Laurie said, that also, you said that the way you conserved something 20 years ago maybe wouldn't be the same way you would do today. I would say also that even today, there isn't only one answer. So this process of care, and I agree with you, I think thinking about caring is probably more, is closer to what we do than the medical profession, but there isn't only one way of responding to the questions that will keep coming, right? So you will just have to respond to it in the context where you are, with the resource that you have in every sense. And that may change, will change in the future, or even in the present, right? Yeah.
And I think that's a wonderful way to end here. Thank you very much, and thank you for your attention.
Nous allons maintenant avoir le plaisir d'écouter Susan Core.
We will now have the pleasure of listening to Susan Core.
Longtemps présidente de l'ECHO, la Confédération européenne des organisations.
A long time she was the chair of ECHO, the European Committee for Conservation and Restoration. ECHO is the leader of one of the work packages of the Charter program, which Susan is going to talk about in more details.
Good afternoon, everybody, and I know it's late and you've had the most incredibly intensive day. It's been fascinating. It is my horrible duty to come after these very wise women in this instance and the very wise things that have been said here today about conservation restoration. I think I'm just going to, where do I even start? So I thought, listening to things today, that a lot of what you are saying, I'm going to try and hang it on my presentation here about this project that's taking place in Europe, because I think it addresses some of the issues, not all of them, because it's, again, very diverse, but a lot of the things that have been said, I hope I can address them through this, because this project is actually about speaking to us as heritage practitioners, to see us in the bigger picture. And just to say, like listening to you, I started out as I had finished my degree in history of art, and I went into the National Gallery of Ireland to start learning conservation. I went into the paper conservation department, and in a taxi, I was asked, "Oh, what are you studying?" And I said, "Well, I'm doing paper conservation." And there was silence, and he finally turned around to me and he said, "Can I ask you about that?" And yeah. And he said, "Are you learning to write really small?" He actually asked me that question, so that I was conserving paper. So I had to think again myself, and I could also say that in 1984, when that title came about, conservation is a paradigm shift. Because I was working with restorers who saw themselves as restorers, and a woman who I'll mention here today, Mairead McParland, because she was my mentor, and a very enlightened person, I would think. And in fact, Gael de Guichon might have known her back in the day. She mentored me and was very much of a conservation viewpoint, because she looked at the bigger picture of how we take care of things and who are we taking care of things for. So in that instance, I would also just like to say that I have been working with ECHO. I'm no longer with ECHO, so I'm an ex-president. And during that time, again, we were very much working towards a legal definition of the profession, very difficult to attain. But asking ourselves, can we make a definition of the profession? And we decided, first of all, yes, we went for a profile in the early days, and that was very difficult. And in 2008, actually, it was published in 2010, we were advised that the best way to move forward for the profession is actually to look at our competences. What are the processes that we express our work through? And that has been, we have then developed a competences framework for the profession to say, here are our competences. And these core competences are incredibly important going forward in this charter project. And the reason why I say that is because in also trying to make representation on behalf of conservator restorers and of the profession, there was two things came up. Does everybody who work in conservation, are they conservator restorers? Is it a field? And if that's the case, is the profession of the conservator restorer restricted to, is conservation restoration restricted to the conservator restorer? And we would argue that it's actually a paradigm of care, and that there are many players. And that in speaking about conservation to politicians, as we had to represent ourselves to the EU, they didn't really want to know about, what is it that you do? And finally, you have to contextualize it by heritage. Who are you doing this for, and what is it about? And so it broadened out into this much broader discussion around heritage. And so the conservator restorers, ECHO, found themselves at the table at this European project. Brilliant, thank you. And so I'll just give you a little bit of background about the Charter project. It was set up by the EU Commission to look at who are the players in cultural heritage. And you must remember this as well. Heritage around the government table gets very little funding. gets enough. Certainly in Ireland, it's considered a loss leader. Basically, it takes funding, it takes resources, it takes financial resources, and you don't see any comeback. And it's defined in a very particular way, and it's defined this way across Europe. So as museums, galleries, archives, and libraries. It's not about the people who work there. And so Charter is just a project that was set up to look and see what are the resources that heritage can offer Europe. And it is about cultural change, because it is about behaviour. And so heritage is seen also as a paradigm. There's been a huge paradigm shift in how we think about heritage as well. And so it is not so much about assets as about heritage per se, who we are, how we are in the world, how we make sense of it. And then we have to speak about how the conservator-restorer fits into this. So there are many people. The other thing about heritage, I would like to say, we all have a stake in it, not just the experts. Everybody has a part in it. And I think, like an analogy earlier, like health, we speak about heritage. We all have a stake in our heritage. There are experts at many levels, but we all have a stake in heritage as well. It's who we are. It locates us in space, time. If you really want to go into it, it's a very profound thing, our heritage. And it is under a lot of pressure as well, because it is about how we have to meet others, how we see ourselves in the world. So it is a vector. We see it as a vector. So what are the careers then that we can have in heritage? So how do we, as so many of the things you were saying, like the definitions, it's a really messy sector. It's very poorly defined, and its concepts and frameworks are very poorly defined in the European statistics, which frames all the policies around which resources are made, policies are made, money is delivered. So it's very poorly. It's very poorly articulated. Although we know who we are actually hugely invisible as in our careers to the outside world. So yes, there's a lack of professional recognition as well for the many different types of people who now see themselves working in a very broadened concept of what heritage is. And can I just say that while, museums, galleries, archives, a tiny amount of people are employed in here. I can tell you 80% of the conservator-restorers that ECHO represented work in private practice, and it is a very difficult area to make a living in. And the point is that if heritage was properly resourced, there is plenty of room for everybody. And there is what we give back, the tourism industry makes a huge amount of heritage, and we get a tiny little bit back. What is going on there? What is wrong? And it is the hope of this project to actually identify some of these issues. It is a skills alliance. It's a blueprint project, and blueprint projects are funded by Erasmus. So it's about skills, it's about competences, and it is about identifying the skills and competences that exist in the heritage professions. And so this is where I suppose it is very important, when we went to participate in this project as ECHO, that we had a very strong sense of what our core competences in the heritage field look like. And furthermore, then in the many regional workshops that have taken place in this project, there is a huge gap between what is being delivered in education and what's going on in the field, what people perceive or think they need. And so this is also something that is trying to be addressed in this project. So it's a bit of a jumble, it's a bit of a mess out there. And I'm just going to go a little bit, and this is technical because the perspectives today have zoomed in. They've been technical, and then they've also been philosophical, and it's been very interesting from that point of view. But I would just like to be a little technical here and give you a very important framework. And this is the NACE codes, upon which all economic activity in Europe, in the world, is in NACE here in Europe. But they feed into the OECD figures, they feed into European statistics, labour force survey. And in the NACE codes, the conservator-restorer does not appear. Neither does the archaeologist. The heritage sector is a tiny area, and that is composed of, as I said, museums, galleries, archives, and monument sites, historic sites and monuments. And this affects our occupations, how we get identified. So, sorry, I think we've gone, okay, I'll just go back actually. Can I go back? Doesn't matter. So we have looked at NACE. ECHO decided to look at NACE and see how the heritage sector A was defined and where the conservator-restorer would fit in. And in trying to do this, the restorer is certainly in the NACE codes, but the restorer is a creative activity. So even conceptually, it's defined differently. It's in the arts. And we are saying, yes, we may be a cultural activity, but we are not actually. It's conceptually doesn't recognize us. So this is a very important idea that we've also had to come to terms with, that the conservator-restorer is not properly reflected in our codes. And so the work that we do, even the conceptual work, is not properly. Although NACE doesn't want to know about concepts, it simply wants to know about economic activity. But it is very telling when our activity cannot be properly identified, because the resources that are required, the resources that goes into our work, we're not seeing back in terms of our salaries. And again, this is a very important point. So when we came to look at the heritage sector, the landscape of where we might exist, it's very fragmented. And so we said, okay, what are the key activities? What are the core activities that belong to cultural heritage? And we identified them as 3 important core areas. One is recognition. Who gets to recognize and identify cultural heritage? How does this happen? And it occurs in our societies, it occurs amongst us. It also, this is the difference, that this heritage paradigm that we talk about, it is now led by people. It is values-based. We look at how values are created and constructed rather than the assets themselves. And this is a huge shift also from the narration of how heritage is. And so we were looking at this. So who gets to do this? And who gets to do this professionally? Because this is an Erasmus project. It is about skills alliance. So we looked at the art historians, the archaeologists, the numismatics. Anybody who deals with the past should be able to find themselves, who thinks about this, should be able to find themselves in recognition. There's the mediators, the people who mediate, communicate, interpret. These are all people now that this broadened and enlarged sense of heritage includes. And these have to find themselves, their skills and their knowledge and their competences in this landscape. We then take preservation and safeguarding. Conservation, restoration belongs here. This is where the paradigm of care takes place. And then there's engagement and use. Who gets to use heritage? How do they get involved? And this is another area, big area of activity. It's supported by research and innovation, by management, and by governance. And so these are all different areas. And we have asked ourselves, if we want an integrated approach, a multidisciplinary approach as well, we said, what does the landscape look like? How does this define itself to others as well? So we developed a kind of a model. It's very flat here, it's 3D. But right at the very heart of this model, we put society, the common good. All our activities serve the common good. And they circulate, so we have at their core the 3 functions that we see as absolutely core, so that while there are transversal skills, these functions have core professions that can be recognized and that can be located in the heritage sector, much like health. And while there are boundaries and it can create boundaries, it's very important that we can identify ourselves as this way. And I would just like to go also to say the reason why we call them functions is because this is speaking to the NACE codes. It's speaking to the classification systems that are built up, the economic classification systems, the occupational classification systems, and to actually make a coherent sector out of heritage and demonstrate who belongs in it. And how are we planning to map this? We are suggesting that this is done, this is just saying trying to put some order on all of this. We will look at the functions, and then we will look at the core activities that, the purpose and role of each of these functions, and the core activities that are described therein, and this is how we would intend to map it. Then we look at the skills that are required to fulfill these activities. And this follows a structure that NACE and the ESCO, how skills are delivered at, through educational delivery routes. So we then said all of these will need different levels of knowledge and are inclusive, but at certain levels they are expert-led. So how did we do this? These are more. So we built ourselves a pyramid. We took the 6 functions and we turned them into what we call a spider's web. And they go from the outside, from the inside out, with the simplest. What is the most simplest thing we can do is remembering. And this is actually still under construction. But we took Bloom's taxonomy because we were actually tying this into a European qualifications framework. So at some point, the EQF kicks in here. And so it's at 10 levels. But to keep it empirical at the same time so that we can invite people to map themselves, we ask them to place their core competences in the area, in the functions that they think that they work in the most. And we then say, well, what do you think your level of expertise is? And so people can see, maybe they can map themselves across this landscape, including people who work in policy making and in management. And an integrated approach to heritage requires that we have some skills at some level across these 6 functions, but we will have key or core skills at a certain level of expertise in key areas. So we had a series of workshops, and we asked people to explore their key tasks, to think about what it is that they do, because these are people who ordinarily wouldn't see themselves as working in heritage. And we asked them to cluster their tasks and map them across the 6 functions. And so we got many different types of maps. And while some people who know what they're doing didn't see much point of it, it is very useful for institutions even to start looking at how they approach developing their institutions in heritage. It doesn't matter what they are, whether they are museums or private companies. We have private companies now using it to see how to rate even interns when they're coming in, how to see where maybe their competences are falling, because it can be developed into core competences. We took the competences of the conservator-restorer and tried to build it into this map. So this is just... Now, we also said that heritage is actually an ecosystem, and it comes from an understanding, if we all work together, of what heritage is, and that the occupations and skills and competences across these 6 functions can build into this ecosystem, and that in order for it to be reflected as a professional sector, we are understanding heritage as a vector for how we are in the world, and to allow people then to map these different professions accordingly, because it is something that we can all experience. And ultimately, that is sense-making. And so where are conservative restorers going to in the future? We just had a look at how it has developed in the past, the preservation paradigm, as opposed to the conservation paradigm, where when I was starting out, it was purely about the object and putting it away, keeping it for future use, or allowing it to be preserved. And now it's much more about the values that define how we are going to use this object, not just in the present, because it is to maintain heritage's cogency, its relevancy, and not to fossilize it, so that it becomes something alive and dynamic. And this is really important as well, if we are going to be sustainable into the future. So This is how to also involve people in that very dynamic of decision making, which is not easy, but I think much has been said about it today here, about how we approach it, how we think about the objects that we are working on, and the decision making processes around that. But the fact is that we each have to have core competences when we come to working in heritage. And this is what we are trying to say, that we are a very viable sector, we are a mature sector, that we are economically viable, and we are hidden. It is invisible. The contribution that we make to our societies is hidden. And that more and more these value chains of economic growth are not sustaining us, and that we have to talk more and more about social value. And in this sense, heritage is very, very powerful. And we are really working in this project to make the case for heritage. And also to look at how we upgrade our own skills, what are the kinds of skills that we need going forward, because an awful lot is being demanded of heritage, at the same time how we can respond to sustainability, how we can respond to climate change. And what we are saying is cultural heritage is about behaviours. It is how we approach behaviour and understanding ourselves and making sense of ourselves. So in that sense, we have an awful lot to offer. And finally, just to bring this to a conclusion, we have been asked to propose 8 areas in which heritage will now develop, or new courses that may be delivered to increase and resource heritage further, and to deliver on the expectations that these future requirements that heritage has to speak to. So one of the 8 areas that we are looking to develop curricula, or that in the future curricula will be developed, is really powerful community engagement. How to develop this, what skills are needed to do this, how has this evolved, how is heritage literacy created, sustainability and built heritage and landscape, to get rid of this dichotomy and this binary relationship between our cultural heritage and our natural heritage. Our landscapes are man-made. We have impacted on our landscapes, and I think climate change is now really speaking to this, and that is why we have to divest ourselves of these binary understandings. Cultural heritage, crafts and knowledge. Again, how is this speaking to us? Because earlier we were talking about lifelong learning. And this is actually a big issue for this project. And this is why I also speak about core competences. One of the recommendations, strong recommendations that is coming out of it, we absolutely have to deliver on core competences. We have to recognize them, and we have to resource them, and we have to deliver them. And at the same time, we have to understand what are the soft skills that we need. But we cannot forget that we still need very much to deliver on our core competences, on the core occupations for cultural heritage. And that lifelong learning, that prior knowledge, and that continuous professional development are now all going to have to be looked at in a completely different way, and in a much more fluid and flexible way. And that, you know, when we wrote the competences framework for the Conservator-Restorer, we wrote it for access only. And that we would expect that a young person starting out in conservation will look completely different by the end, and experience has a huge amount to contribute to this, and that also needs to be recognised. So when we did our map, what we're actually trying to make ourselves visible not only to each other but to other sectors, because other sectors are going to land in the heritage sector. They are coming with different competences, and we need them. But they need to know where to land, and they need to know how to identify what are the skills and competences that they need or are required to work in cultural heritage, so that we are visible to them as well. So new heritage in conservation restoration, this is a bit of a misnomer. We're actually talking about this new paradigm of heritage, and how does that affect conservation restoration? So that really is what we're looking at. What do we need to do to deliver? Much is asked of us on sustainability, for instance, on community engagement. Conservator restorers don't need full-on expertise and community engagement. Some conservators don't like communicating. But at the same time, you can place yourself and say, well, okay, I can do this or I can do that, or think about it in a much more conceptual way. It might not be actually participating and communicating, but it can be about how you're actually negotiating the values that you are bringing to bear when you come to work on an object. That is also a way of engaging. And we are doing it already, and as we have been multidisciplinary from the start, we've been working in ECHO many, many years, and I can think that that is one of the aspects of it that is very much to the fore. So cultural heritage in the digital environment. Digital environment is seen purely as a tool. It's very interesting what's coming out. We don't all have to be digital experts. We can get the digital experts in, but it is to know how to narrate heritage, how to interpret it, how to communicate it, and how to use those digital skills to increase access, to increase heritage literacy. Participatory leadership and management, we are saying policymakers need heritage skills. They need to know about heritage and cultural heritage policy design and regulation. And so that's also to do with international cultural relations, trafficking, war, restitution, and all of this kind of stuff. So I've spoken, I've tried to condense this down. I hope I've made sense. I would just like to thank you for a most engaging day. I hope I'll pass it over to you, I think, Eleanor. I really condensed that down. Any questions or questions? No? Okay. Oh, there is.
David Quico again. Just a general remark, but thank you very much for reopening our thinking. And I wanted, I'm sorry because it's not... En français. I'm talking to Susan at the moment. But also I would like to express the idea that the conference here today make an homage by applause to Christoph von Imhoff and Agnes Ballestrom. Christoph died 3 months ago, and I think it should be the place to say hello to him and say bye. I don't know what you think, but I think this is the proper time to do it. Christoph was a very important guy and very friendly people. So if we can applaudir pour lui. Vraiment, je pense que ça serait...
I think it's important to give him a round of applause.
Well said. Thank you.
How do we wrap up today? For me, with a few words, I hope. I'll keep my voice going. But Susan's words really struck home and brought to mind a quote that I use often with my students from Max Friedlander. The job of the restorer is the most thankless one. In the best case, no one is aware of him. Well, nowadays her. His mastery remains invisible, but his failing becomes evident. Restoration is nevertheless a necessary bad thing. So I think this really does sum up today. I'm not sure we need a new definition, but we need multiple definitions. We need definitions that are applicable in different regions of the world, in the global south, in the north, in different climatic zones, within different functions within society. And definitely ICOMCC can provide that platform for discussion and review, reflection and inspiration, I hope. So I hope that today's event, and we're so thankful to FFCR for giving us this opportunity to review and revise and look upon the 1984 document. I'm so grateful for this morning's speakers to putting that in a historical perspective, and our 3 panels this afternoon with amazing speakers, except for me, who hasn't got a voice. But it wouldn't be possible without Eleanor and Clementine. So really a big, huge thank you and round of applause to them. Thank you so much.
Merci, Kate.
Thank you, Kate. I just wanted to come back to Susan's final words on competences. And it seems obvious when she says it, you know, it's about thinking about access to the profession and not necessarily all those that we acquire in the course of our careers. And I think that everything we've said today, be it about the emerging practices, theories, skills, I think it speaks to all of that. And thinking in terms of access to the profession, that sets out a useful framework. And then, of course, we can deviate from that to some extent. But all of that will be guided by our code of ethics. So I thought it was nice to end on that note, and I believe that brings us to the end of this symposium. And I'd like to thank all of our speakers today. They didn't have much notice, but they made themselves available. They prepared their contributions, they shared all of their various experiences and perspectives. So thank you. I also wanted to thank the organizing committee at the FFCR, Eleonore, Pauline, Chloe Barn and others, the organizing committee on the ICOMCC side, Kate, Stephanie, and of course the Quai Branly Museum, the teams, the technical teams, and all those who've been working hard throughout the day, the caterers, the interpreters, the verbatim reporters. So this was a very rich dialogue. It really speaks to our vibrant community, always prepared to engage in thought about itself. So I do hope you enjoyed it and that we can continue our exchanges. And in any event, you can always count on our federation and on ICOM conservation, perhaps, to bring this to fruition. Thank you. I just wanted to give you one piece of information. The museum will be closing at 10 p.m. tonight. And the agenda, the program leaflet gives you access to all of our exhibits. So the staff here is aware of that. So with the program in hand, you should be able to have access. And you're very welcome. Thank you.